Coming up on this episode of Booked on Rock, in 1972, David Ackles' third album, American Gothic, was released. The music press declared it the album of the year. Melody Maker called it a classic. The Sunday Times described it as the Sgt. Pepper of folk, suggesting that it heralded a whole new direction in music. After a fourth and final album in 1973, Ackles vanished. What became of David Ackles? Find out next with author Mark Brend.
We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome everybody back to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. I'm Eric Senich. Mark Brend is our guest. He's the author of Downriver in Search of David Ackles. Mark, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
David Ackles, an artist who people either know and love, including fellow musicians Phil Collins and Elton John and Elvis Costello, or they don't know him at all. There's no middle ground, as you say in the book. How did you discover David Ackles?
Well, by chance, a long time ago, 40 years ago, I walked into a shop and saw an album that I liked the look of, liked the sleeve, and I didn't know who David Ackles was, but the record was from 1968. It was on Elektra, and it was his debut album. And I knew that Elektra Records was a good bet, and 1968 was a period I was interested in, so I bought the record speculatively and loved it, absolutely loved it. And then afterwards, managed to get hold of his other three albums.
Talk about the process of compiling research material for this book. You do give a lot of credit to Janice Vogel Ackles. That was David's wife, for her contributions. And how else did you manage to put together this story? Because it was challenging at times.
Yeah, it was. I mean, you're talking about somebody who died in 1999 and who was working in the 60s and early 70s as a recording artist. So many of his contemporaries aren't around anymore. And those that are, not surprisingly, can't necessarily remember details of events from 55 years ago or more. I spoke quite a lot, as you say, with Janice. We've been speaking over many years, also with some close friends of David's and some colleagues who work with him in the studio, including a guy called Douglas Graham, who co-produced David's fourth album, Bernie Taupin, who produced David's third album. I did manage to speak to quite a few people, but also an awful lot of research into archives, so Musicians Union archives to get session records, and lots of press cuttings. David Ackles got a lot of press interest at the time, although he didn't sell many records. There were an awful lot of interviews with him where you hear him talking about his career in real time, and it was they were very insightful to me. But of course, I did also briefly have brief contact with David himself in the last year of his life. We spoke on the phone and exchanged emails.
Let's get into Ackles' story now. He had a strict Protestant upbringing, spent time as a child actor. In fact, he said that the family move to California was because of his acting career. Where and when was he born? What were his childhood years like?
He was born in the late 30s in Rock Island, but the family moved to California when he was probably about 8 or 9, I think. He had an older sister, and then much later on a younger sister. And as far as I can judge, a close and happy family life. He was his mother was English, but had moved. She had emigrated to America as a child with her family. And on her side of the family, there were a lot of people who were professional music hall performers. So these were people who were on the stage in England in the late Victorian years and early 20th century, doing light entertainment, doing sketches, song and dance routines, that sort of thing. And David's mum, who was called Queenie, she encouraged David and his sister in particular, his older sister, to follow that family line. And so David, from the age of 4 or 5, was in a song and dance duo with his sister. They were called the Ackles twins, but they weren't twins. But and it was through that David got recognized by a guy who was working in Hollywood producing a series of B movies, and David got signed up to play a supporting role in those films, which are about Rusty the dog. And there were, I think, 7 or 8 of those films. David was in 6 of them.
Was it kind of like a Lassie spinoff?
Absolutely, yeah. The films are about an hour long, and Rusty normally gets involved in some kind of scrapes and dramas, and he's owned by a boy who has a little group of friends with him, and David was one of the group of friends in the Rusty films.
There was an interview Ackles gave in 1968 that led to some confusion. Enduring confusion, as you read it in the book, the article stated that he had served jail time before finding God.
Yes. What David later said about that, he explained in another interview that the interview with the Los Angeles Times journalist was somebody who he knew, an old friend. And as far as David was concerned, they were joking. And David talked about, oh yes, I've been to 6 prisons or something like that. What he was actually talking about was singing in a choir that was touring prisons and and performing to entertain the inmates. But the journalist got the wrong end of the stick and thought that David himself had served time in those prisons. And in fact, when David died, the Los Angeles Times published a short obituary which referenced that again, referenced the same mistake. And David's surviving sister had to write in and correct them, and her letter was published the following week.
Up until the mid-50s, he was more actor and dancer than musician. It would be a while still before his debut album was recorded. He actually turned 30 in February of 1967 when his music career starts. And as you write, he was set for a very low-key creative life. There's almost nothing to suggest, though, that before the year was out, he would be recording his debut album for the hippest of U.S. record labels. Tell us about the unexpected and unsought-for opportunity that led him to recording his debut. He was a musician at that point. He was writing music, but he hadn't intended to record his own album.
That's right. Yeah, he was writing and taking part in musical theatre productions. That was his big interest. He'd been studied at the University of Southern California, and a guy called David Anderley was a fellow student there, and David Ackles and David Anderley were in a couple of college productions together. And they lost touch, but then they ran into each other in 1967 in the summer. And David Anderley had just joined Elektra as an A&R man. And David Ackles said, I've got some songs, can I play them to you? And that led to him being signed to Elektra. Really, it might not have happened for him at all if it hadn't have been for that chance meeting. But he was initially signed as a songwriter, recorded some demos with Elektra, but Jack Holtzman, who had formed the company and was still running it at that point, said that David should make it his own album. And so I think he signed in late 67, and by early 68, he was doing the first sessions for his album.
You do write in the book about the problem finding suitable venues for him to play in. He wasn't a rock musician, so rock clubs and supporting slots with rock bands tended to go badly. How much of that do you feel affected the success of that first album and Ackles' overall success with audiences?
It possibly did. It's a bit. I've heard tapes of him playing live, and his playing and singing were excellent. There's no doubt about it. But there was something about his music that didn't have a natural home live, and so just a guy playing a piano supporting a rock band wasn't really going to work. He tended to play in folk clubs quite a bit and was quite often described as a folk artist, but he obviously isn't a folk artist. And so I think he probably struggled to find a natural home playing live. He also said several times that he didn't want to go out on endless tours. He didn't like that, and what he tended to do was to go to small clubs and play residencies, like 4 or 5 nights over a long weekend or something like that.
That would have worked more so maybe later in his career, kind of like what Billy Joel does now. But at that time, you had to go out there on the road and really plug it.
Yeah. I mean, I think he wasn't a big stage performer. It's interesting because he performed a lot in front of the camera and on the stage in theatre productions, but it seems to be that when he was there on his own singing his songs, that he actually was very nervous, and his wife Janice said later that he was often physically ill before going on. Uh, you can't always tell that from tapes of him playing live, but there are a few reviews where the writer comments that he seemed nervous.
He was more comfortable as part of an ensemble. But it's interesting that you have people like Elton John and Bernie Taupin who said they felt that they should have been opening for David, but instead he was opening for Elton at the Troubadour in Los Angeles. In fact, he was part of that famous residency there in August of 1970 for Elton. But Elton was a huge fan, and so was Bernie. But yeah, they thought this guy should be the headliner, not us.
Yeah, David, when his first album was released in 1968, Elektra brought him over to Europe for several months, and he was in London for quite a few weeks. Was on TV, did a radio session, and was in the press quite a bit. And he didn't sell many records, but he got quite a bit of attention. There are quite a few cover versions of his songs, and that it was at that time that Elton John and Bernie Taupin picked up on him. So he was known amongst musicians and serious music fans in England at that time, and very highly regarded. Um, but but unusually, strangely, he didn't quite pick up such an audience in America, really. He didn't get so much notice until his third album, American Gothic.
That second album, 1969, Subway to the Country, again, positive critical review, but did not succeed commercially. He moved to England to write and arrange his third album, American Gothic. This is produced by Bernie Taupin. It's released to multiple positive reviews, hailing it the album of the year, some cases possibly the greatest record ever made. Ackles felt uncomfortable with that kind of critical reception. He told the reporter, quote, "It's only an album." He downplayed it. Why was he so ambivalent, you think? Was it too much pressure on him?
I think it probably did create pressure on him, but also what happened was that you got this strange thing. If you line up all the reviews, the album, because the album first started to get reviewed several months before it was released, and it was still being reviewed several months after. So you have a period of about 6 months where it was getting reviewed. And initially the reviews were ecstatic. People were, as you say, claiming it was one of the greatest records ever made. But a little bit later on, you started to get a few commentators saying, well, I don't quite see this. It's kind of good, but it's what's all the fuss about? And I think David, he commented at one point that people were starting to review the initial reviews, if you see what I mean, but that they weren't responding to the music. They were responding to those initial responses to the album. And so that all got a bit confused.
Bernie Taupin called the album a difficult sell. It didn't fit in with popular music at the time. Do you agree?
I do, yeah. It's a very unusual record, and most people, well, I say most people, a lot of people read about it and come to the album with no context and are a little puzzled by it initially and have to work at it. I think you understand it more if you've heard the first two albums, and you kind of break yourself in gently. It didn't have obvious singles on it. It was hard to place it in any kind of context of the time. David Ackles was often grouped with the singer-songwriter movement, but he really was nothing like somebody like Jackson Browne or James Taylor, for example.
For those listening, hopefully you go and look for the music of David Ackles on Spotify. It's there, YouTube. But how would you best describe his sound? It's hard to compare him with anybody. I guess you could say he's in that genre with an Elton John or a James Taylor, but he had his own style.
Yeah, I mean,
because of his theatric background, I think.
Yeah, there's a strong musical theatre influence. A lot of the songs are very intense and quite melodramatic. He's a piano-playing singer-songwriter, not a guitar player, so that sets him aside from a lot of people. I think the main thing that I always think about him is that he's a storyteller. The songs are like little one-act plays or short stories. They're very character-driven. They're often sung in the first person, but that doesn't mean they're autobiographical. What he tended to do and did very cleverly was he would approach an issue, sometimes quite a difficult issue like divorce or racism or something like that, but not approach it as a social issue. He'd approach it through the eyes of one or two characters and create a little story to explore the issue.
Eventually, comparing the album to Sgt. Pepper, saying it's the greatest album ever by critics, that would backfire on Ackles, right?
I think it did, yeah. I mean, Elektra, not so. There were a couple of early reviews, one in Los Angeles Free Press and one in the Sunday Times in Britain, which made pretty much the same claims, that it was the Sgt. Pepper of folk and either the greatest album ever made or the second greatest album ever made. And Elektra, not surprisingly, jumped on those claims and advertised the album with quotes from those reviews. And there are lots of subsequent reviews which were equally positive. But I think in the end it did backfire a bit because a lot of people, when they bought the record, were a bit puzzled by it and couldn't quite match up what they were hearing with the claims.
The Booked on Rock podcast will be back after this.
Patience, little dear. Everything has to be in order.
Hey guys, thanks so much for checking out the Booked on Rock podcast. If you've just found the podcast, welcome. If you've been listening, thank you so much for your support. And make sure you tell a friend, a family member, share on social media, and let people know about Booked on Rock. And if you do like the podcast, make sure you subscribe, give a 5-star review wherever you listen to the Booked on Rock podcast. We're on Amazon, Apple, iHeart, Spotify, Spreaker, TuneIn, and on YouTube Music. You can check out the full episodes on video, along with video highlights from episodes on the Booked on Rock YouTube channel. Find it at Booked on Rock. Thanks again for listening. Now back to the show. Mark Brend is the author of Downriver, In Search of David Ackles. The book is out now. Ackles and Elektra boss Jack Holtzman agree that it's time for Ackles to leave the label. And Clive Davis steps in to sign Ackles to Columbia. Okay, so great news. Maybe this is where we see David Ackles get the notoriety he so deserves. Not so. What happens next?
With that deal, Clive was apparently a big fan of David's and was keen to sign him, but there wasn't a lot of money in the deal. So David decided to largely record the album at home. He had a 4-track, set up a little home studio, had the musicians in his front room, and then took the tapes into a slightly bigger studio to do a few overdubs and mix the album. So it was a low budget thing, but that's what he wanted to do. After American Gothic, which was a really big production, orchestra, all of this type of thing, he wanted something smaller and more intimate. When they were getting towards the end of the album, the recording process, David heard that Clive Davis had been sacked from Columbia, and David didn't know a soul at Columbia apart from Clive Davis, and so was completely adrift there. And at the same time, by very unfortunate coincidence, David's manager upped and left. He just moved on, and that was the end of that relationship. So David found himself with an album that was just finished, but no support in the record company and no manager to vouch for him. And Columbia put the album out in America only, not in the UK where he had more of a following, and very much the impression that they put it out because they were contractually obliged to, but there was very little promotion. It was a very low-key thing, and the album vanished really quite quickly. And that was the end of his career. He never made another record.
Yeah. And his album Five and Dime, 1973, that would be his last. He leaves Columbia and never makes another record, although that wasn't his plan. He figured he'd come back at some point, but that never happened. But he did have a publishing contract with Warner Brothers. This is interesting. So he was with Columbia, but he was also with Warner Brothers under contract with them. What was he doing for them? How did that all work?
It's a bit difficult to unpick that, and I'm not sure I fully understand all the details. But when he left Columbia, his songwriting publishing probably was he was still contracted to Warner's, and so what for some time he tried to make it as a songwriter for other artists, which was actually closer to his original intention back in 1967, 68. And he wrote songs, went to regular Warner's songwriter meetings and pitched songs to other artists, but none of them were picked up. And after a while, he just realized it was going nowhere and gave up on that.
And he himself admitted he was not the type of person who was determined to find another label. He felt like it maybe just wasn't meant to be after a while. Janis talks about how he just wasn't that type of guy who would work the room, didn't have that aggressive attitude. Could he have found another label, in your opinion, if he himself was a little more aggressive, or maybe had somebody with him that could be more aggressive?
I'm sure it was possible. Yeah. He was very hard to place musically, and that always would have been a challenge because you couldn't fit him neatly into any genre. But the talent is so obvious and so abundant. I feel that he could have continued a career if he'd had somebody supporting him. I think the loss of the manager was a disaster really for David. And as you say, as a personality himself, he wasn't going to run the business side of things as well as be the writer and the performer.
He was more of a passive type, which is a lot of times you need that manager on your side to I was just watching the Billy Joel documentary, and his wife, his first wife, was that type of person that really benefited his career because she could do the things that he just wasn't comfortable doing.
Yeah, I mean, don't get the impression that David Ackles was passive.
Yeah.
He was by all accounts a kind of outward going, upbeat, optimistic sort of guy. But, finding your way in the music business in the world of major record labels then was very hard, I'm sure. And he was on his own. He just didn't have any support.
What was the rest of the 70s like for David? Because one person talks about visiting him at his house. At that time, David was working at USC, but also he was weaving rugs.
Yes, that was just a remark that somebody made. David, he did lots of things after his recording career ended. He did quite a lot of teaching at USC. He also spent some time writing film and television scripts with Douglas Graham, who was the guy who co-produced Five and Dime, and they got a TV movie produced that was first shown, I think, in 1980 or 81. So he had some success there, but he had a varied working life. But what he didn't give up creatively. What he wanted to do was write musical theatre pieces, and he wrote at least 2 fully realised musical theatre productions each with 20 or 30 songs and a full script, and he recorded demos for them, and he was working on one of those within 2 years of his recording career ending, but sadly he never got full productions of them. One of them had some workshop productions but didn't quite go into full production.
Was that Sister Amy?
Sister Amy had the workshop production, yeah. And there was one before that, which went under various titles, but was again, fully developed. And I've heard some of the songs from it, and it was clear that his songwriting gift didn't desert him at all.
David almost died in a car accident in 1981. What happened?
He was driving home with his young son in the car, and somebody came around a corner on the wrong side of the road and crashed into him. And I think that driver was under the influence and didn't have insurance and that type of thing. David was very seriously injured and had to have several operations and was using a wheelchair for some time afterwards, but did recover, although Janis has said that she thinks he had discomfort for the rest of his life.
The Booked on Rock podcast will be back after this.
I gotta go now, but don't you leave town, huh?
Find the Booked on Rock website at bookedonrock.com. There you can find all the back episodes of the show, the latest episode in video and audio, links to all of the platforms where you can listen to the podcast, plus all the social media platforms. We're on Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and X. Also, check out the Booked on Rock blog, find your local independent bookstore, find out all the latest hot rock book releases, and before you go, check out the Booked on Rock online store. Pick up some Booked on Rock merch. It's all at bookedonrock.com. Going back to Sister Amy now, he worked on that project throughout the 80s and 90s. What was it about? What was the main character? What was it about that main character that appealed to David?
So Sister Amy is about Amy McPherson, who was what would you call her, a celebrity evangelist in America from the 20s through to the 40s. And she was a very flamboyant, high-profile person, had her own radio station, built a huge church with, I think, an auditorium for 5,000 people and that sort of thing. She was quite controversial. Some people thought she was a bit of a fraud, but there was an odd episode in her life where she went missing for several weeks, and people wondered whether she was dead. And then she re-emerged, sort of turned up at a hospital in a rather confused state and said she'd been kidnapped and had been held for several weeks and had managed to escape. And some people flatly didn't believe that. And there was a big media scandal about it and lots of claims and counterclaims. Some of the claims being that she faked her own kidnapping to run off with her sound engineer, I think it was. Anyway, David was fascinated by her because she was obviously a conflicted person, somebody of faith, but who also struggled with things of the world, if you like. And Sister Amy is really focuses on that kidnapping, if it was a kidnapping. And in fact, in David's play, he is very much comes down on the side of it being a ruse by Amy McPherson to escape the pressure and run off with this man.
And David was diagnosed with lung cancer in the early 90s. He did beat it at first. Sadly, he succumbed to cancer in 1999. Going back to, you had mentioned you had spoken to him in the last few years of his life, and he seemed to be happy. He was writing music. He'd hit the gym in the morning, write music, play piano, go for hikes. Seemed to be in a really good place. What do you recall about those conversations with him?
Yeah, his 3 Electra albums were reissued in the UK in the early 90s, and he did a few Where Are They Now, Whatever Happened To interviews with the UK music press, and I did one of those a little bit later on. He was very cheerful and buoyant and positive and good-humoured, and I thought quite genuinely wasn't at all bitter or disappointed about the end of his music career. I think he had some disappointment at the time, but he moved on from it. I mean, I've spoken to people whose careers have come to an end, they've sort of seem to harbor a resentment forevermore, like they didn't get their due. I didn't pick that up at all with him, and everyone else I know who spoke to him says the same thing. He was grateful to be able to make the records. He thought they were good, but it came to an end and he moved on to other things and had a good life.
You say at the end of the book that there are no definitive answers as to why David Ackles, his music underachieved commercially when it was released and why it hasn't gained cult status since his death, but 2 things keep coming back. One is about how the music business is set up. The other has to do with Ackles' music. Can you expand on that and your observation on the lost genius?
I think it's something that's a perpetually engaging story, I think, of the idea of rediscovering somebody. And God, isn't he great? And it's not just in music. It happens in all sorts of fields, but you see it a lot in music. Somebody who has underachieved or been forgotten in their life after they've gone, or perhaps when they're still alive, but they've been in obscurity for a long time. They're suddenly recognized, and this idea of discovering something that's hidden treasure, I think, is very appealing. But very often, I think in the music business, that narrative is very entwined with tragedy. So it seems to be a particularly potent narrative if the person has had some kind of tragic end. You know, there's an early death, mental illness, something very dramatic happening to them. And David, I think, David Ackles, doesn't fit neatly into that at all, because although there were challenges and difficulties in his life, as there are in everybody's, he wasn't a tragic figure at all. He was a popular, happy man, and so he doesn't quite fit the story that so often carries music from the past back to new audiences.
Downriver in Search of David Ackles is out now. You can find it wherever books are sold. Look for it at your nearest bookstore. Go to bookedonrock.com to find your nearest independent bookstore. And people can reach out to you, Mark, online. Is there anywhere where people can connect with you?
Yeah, I guess there is. Yeah, I mean, I don't have a website or anything like that. I'm on Blue Sky, and people can always find me through the publisher's Jawbone Press.
Great. I will put the link up to the Blue Sky page and also to Jawbone Press as well. Mark Brend, thank you.
Thank you very much. Cheers, Eric.
That's it. It's in the books.